Part 1. The Dream. The dream came like a streetlight snapping on in the dead of night. Abrupt, blinding, and unbearably precise. He stood at the edge of a rocky pier, salt wind tearing at the collar of his coat. A gull cried and wheeled above. There was rain in the air, but it fell sideways, slashing the world into cold silver ribbons. Ahead, under a hive of scaffolding and halogen lamps, a warehouse door stood open like the mouth of an animal. Inside the dream warehouse, there was a smell, copper and diesel, and something sweeter and rotten under it all. He could hear water dripping. There was a smell of laundry soap from a washer somewhere, and then a sound, a muffled, rasping breath. He crossed the wet planks. On a pallet, a scarf, sky blue, woven with a tiny pattern of white anchors, lay in a puddle. He reached down and felt the fibers between his fingers. Then he saw her, a woman on the floor, eyes half open, one hand curled as if she were still holding something. A dog lay under a table nearby, trembling but alive. On the woman's wrist, a small, crooked tattoo of a star. He woke with his heart slamming against his ribs. The alarm on his phone blinked 3:12 m. Marco Diaz sat up in the dark and looked at his hands. They were calloused from needlework. Thin, practical hands that had never broken a window, never raised a fist. A tailor, that was his life. Thread, scissors, the smell of starch, and fresh cloth. He mended collars for men who never learned to ask forgiveness out loud. He cut suits with quiet precision. He kept his head down and his shop open. Diaz Bespoke, a narrow storefront on a quiet block, 2 doors down from a laundromat and across from the old pier. He had never had an image like that before, never a scrap of violent detail that wasn't a movie or a headline. He pushed himself up, the wooden floor cold through his socks, and the memory of the scarf burned in the back of his skull like a brand. Outside, the world was soft and empty. The laundromat's security light hummed. A car passed slowly, its tires rippling puddles. Marco could have folded the dream away, pinned it like fabric, and put it on a shelf. He could have returned to patterns and pins and pretended the image meant nothing. Instead, he did something he'd never done in his 37 years. He went to the pier. Part 2. The pier in daylight, the waterfront looked tame but honest. Gulls, fishing nets, a line of rusting bollards, the smell of old fish hung low. The warehouse on Dock 17 had a new sign on its door for a company called Seabreak Logistics. Trucks came and went on weekday mornings. Today there was a single salted pickup parked at the site. 2 men in dark jackets smoked beside an entrance. They watched Marco like men watching a man who'd forgotten to leave his wallet at home. Marco kept his head down and walked the plank that took him past the yellowed posters advertising weekend bands and faded seafood festivals. He wanted to see, to touch, to prove the dream a lie. He neared the warehouse and spotted, half hidden under a pallet, a strip of sky blue cloth matted with grime. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The anchor pattern shimmered in the pale dawn light. A hairline of sodium chloride crested the edge. The fibers smelled faintly of laundry soap. Marco pressed the cloth to his chest, then felt blood. His pulse thudded in his throat. He realized his palms were wet. He looked up. The 2 men had gone inside. The pickup's engine started and it rolled out, wheels throwing up spray. He pocketed the scarf. The dream had given him detail after detail. Now reality matched it. The tattooed wrist, the dog. Why had the animal remained alive? Who had left such a specific memory inside his mind? On impulse, he walked to the laundromat next door and bought a cup of coffee. The woman behind the counter, thin white hair pulled tight into a bun, named Ethel by the little mama tag on her cardigan, glanced at the scarf when he set it on the counter. "That's Seabreak's work," she said without looking directly at him. "They bring things in from the ships. Everything smells like someone else's life. Has anyone reported something missing?" Marco asked. "Someone with a blue scarf?" Ethel's eyes slid for a beat toward the pier. You're better off asking about a missing girl. The police have been by twice this week. Not my business, Mr. Diaz. Missing girl? Marco echoed. His voice sounded small. Ethel shrugged. Young lady from up on Beacon Hill, barely 24. Lila Kane. Used to walk her dog down here. Folks say she went out one night and never came back. Her ma's been out crying ever since. Marco's ears hummed. Lila Kane. The name caught on his tongue like a splinter. He imagined the dream woman's tattoo, the dog beneath the table. Lila often walked a border collie by the pier. He had patched Lila's father's coat 2 summers ago after a storm. He had met Lila once to deliver the garment. He remembered her laugh, bright and quick, like a pocket of sunlight. The coincidence tightened into something urgent. Where did you hear the police were? Marco asked. Ethel tapped the register like it held the world's patience. Midtown PD. A detective in a gray coat took notes last time. She came from the precinct on Harbor Street. Marco cradled his coffee like a talisman. Harbor Street. He could walk there in 20 minutes. Before he left, something tugged at him. The dog. If she had a dog, he started, would they have found the pet? Ethel shook her head. Dog disappeared the night she did. Folks thought maybe the dog wandered off or someone took it. No one expects a dog to be left behind. She slid a wrinkled receipt across the counter. If you're really nosy, Mr. Diaz, you'll find the right coat pocket to pull at. Part 3. The Detective Mara O'Connell of Harbor Street. Precinct had the tired look of someone who'd been awake too long and had an internal clock that refused to sync with time off. She had a badge that had seen better years and a coffee thermos that was, in truth, more important to her than most of the people whose addresses she carried in her head. She'd been the lead on Lila Kane's missing person file for 6 weeks. Interviews, canvassing the waterfront, 1,000 empty promises. Now Minor Tailor had walked into the precinct with a sky blue scarf in the palm of his hand and an earnestness she didn't often see. Marco waited while Mara fired a cigarette and blinked out the first light. She scanned him slowly. Tailored suit, thread caught on a cuff, hands that carried small stains, the sign of a man who worked with fabric and not fear. You're not family, she said. So why are you here? He set the scarf on her desk. I had a dream, he said. He looked at his feet like a child about to tell on a friend. I know that sounds mad, but I dreamed about the pier, about a warehouse, about Lila. I found this. It was under a pallet. Mara looked at the scarf, fingers tracing the anchors. She felt something harden behind her ribs. Police intuition is a map of lies and truths. Anchors were a repetitive detail in the missing person photos. Lila wore a blue scarf, even in the photos the family had provided to the flyers. Men bring me all kinds of weird tonight, she said. Dreams, premonitions, priests, ex-friends. Why should I believe you? Because I'm not a man who, Marco faltered. He'd gone in expecting skepticism, but not rudeness. Because I know things about the warehouse that aren't yet public. The door is unlocked sometimes. The trucks come in past midnight. I saw 2 men there. I thought I should bring it in. Detective O'Connell tilted her head. How many nights have you been down at the pier? Just once. Last night, Marco said. But I dreamt this. My head gave me coordinates like a stitch in a pattern. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe I'm crazy. Mara stood. The thermos in her hand warmed the room like an unspoken truce. She pulled a case file out from under a stack, a folder with Lila's name written in black marker. Photographs slid out, Lila smiling with her dog, Lila holding a coffee on a corner, Lila in a thrifted jacket with a star tattoo on her wrist that matched the dream. You met her before? Mara asked. I altered her jacket last summer. She was kind. She had light in her eyes. Mara snapped the photos back together, and for a second, the lines of the case made a shape in her head. The scarf in front of her had no official tag. It could have been planted. Or it could be the thread that started a ball of truth rolling downhill. "All right," Mara said finally. "We'll go down to Dock 17 together. You'll show me where you found it. If my sergeant asks why we're following a tailor with a nighttime fantasy, you tell him I had no better option." Outside the precinct, the first honest light of morning uncoiled over the harbor. Marco left the scarf on Mara's desk, but his hands were already itching to move, to sew the world back into order. Mara stuffed the scarf in an evidence bag and pinned it with the case number. At the pier, they found something else. A tuft of coarse fur snagged on a corroded bolt near the warehouse entrance. It looked like it came from a border collie. Mara turned to Marco. "Sometimes dreams are just cluttered sleep," she said. "But sometimes they're a map. And I hate maps that don't lead somewhere." Part 4, threads lead everywhere. The day became a slow knot of meetings. Mara pulled surveillance from nearby cameras, the sort that seldom caught anything but the neighbor's late-night garbage pickup. The footage for the week of Lila's disappearance had a dead zone, the warehouse. S local network had a camera offline the night Lila vanished. Marco's dream mattered because it contained specifics: the pattern on the scarf, the pallet near the back door, the dog's reaction. Small things, but the kind that stack up. Mara had the nuance of a detective who'd learned to read details like Braille. She asked the pier foreman about cargo manifests, and on the third question, the foreman muttered a name: Seabrake Logistics, the same company Ethel had uttered. Seabrake's books were deliciously clean. They moved containers for longshoremen and big clients. But under the ledger's gloss, a pattern appeared: several shipments listed as textiles, no inspection, had been offloaded at odd hours and reclassified under shell entries. One entry showed a small crate sent onward to an address in the industrial district with a tiny note: Benito St., Lab 4. Mara drove them there. Lab 4 was a door with a keypad and a sign that read, in understated letters, Atlantic Textile Reclaiming, LC. At first glance, it looked like a place that reclaimed old fibers, pulped them, and redistributed them into low-grade canvas. The manager, a man named Hector Silva, was defensive at the door. "No one brings living animals into Lab 4, Hector insisted. "We accept waste textile, not..." "Were you open past midnight the week of October 16th? Mara asked. Hector hesitated. "There were pickups after hours. Some clients required discretion. We returned over to contract work from Seabrake. Discretion." The word landed like a drop needle. Marco remembered the hair on his hand rising in the dream when the dog was near the woman. He thought of the border collie tuft. He thought of a scar of ink, the tiny star tattoo, and how human bodies can become commodities if a system is willing to look the other way. Hector's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and cursed under his breath. That truck that picked up at 3:00 It was labeled Private Sample Transfer. I thought it was a joke. I didn't ask. Mara took a breath. She had a warrant for the crates on Benito Street within 24 hours. Meanwhile, Marco called Ethel and asked the laundromat if any dog owners had come by asking about a missing collie. There had been a flyer, she said, but no one claimed the dog. Lila's mother had left the flyers along the pier and on ambulance poles, but fear had a habit of drying voices. People assumed bad things happened to other people. That evening, as the sun sank and the city lights blinked on, Mara called Marco. One of the crates, she said low, had a shipping manifest mismarked. We traced the tracking number. It ended at a small private facility on the edge of the county. Have you ever sewn a collar with a hidden tag? No, Marco said. Mara made it sound like a dry laugh. You might tonight. Because whoever put that scarf there didn't expect you to pick it up. They expected someone else. The line clicked dead. Marco folded the dream scarf into the pocket of his jacket and looked at his hands. They were the same hands that had stitched a suit for a man who, Dee never learned to say sorry. Soon they might be the hands that sewed a seam of truth, one stitch at a time. Cliffhanger for parts 5 to 8. Mara's warrant on Lab 4 unearths crates labeled with false identities. The dog is found, alive but terrified, and its GPS tag, placed by its owner months ago, points to an offshore shipping manifest. Marco discovers a second dream, the woman's voice whispering one phrase, Benito as number. He realizes the dream is changing, updating. Someone or something is guiding him. And in the police evidence photo of Lab 4, there is an object in the background, a pendant with a tiny star motif, freshly polished. Part 5, the second dream, it started the same way, the pure, the cold air, the smell of diesel and salt. But this time, Lila wasn't lying still. She was sitting up in the shadows, her face pale but her eyes sharp. The dog was gone. She lifted her hand slowly and pointed past Marco's shoulder, toward a shape in the dark. Benito's number, she whispered. Then she was gone, swallowed by shadow. Marco woke to the echo of voice, his shirt sticking to his skin with sweat. The clock read 4:02 and mid-morning. He was in Mara's office. She didn't laugh this time. Benito? She said, flipping through case notes. Not a common name here. Could be a street, a person, or a friend. She pulled a city registry up on her monitor. One match stood out, Benito Street Storage, an unlicensed warehouse a mile inland, owned on paper by a shell company linked to, no surprise, Seabreak Logistics. Mara looked up at him. You're coming with me. But this time, Diaz, you stay in the car unless I say otherwise. Marco nodded. The scarf in his pocket felt heavier than it should. Part 6, Benito Street. Benito Street looked like the kind of place even rats didn't visit twice. Cracked asphalt, weeds pushing through the seams, and graffiti in jagged slashes of black and red. The warehouse itself was a squat concrete box with only one rolling door. Mara and her partner, Detective Harris, approached cautiously. Marco sat in the unmarked sedan, trying not to stare at the windows. Then he saw it, painted faintly above the loading dock, a small star symbol, barely visible beneath layers of grime. His heart skipped, the tattoo, the pendant, the dream. Inside, Mara found stacks of crates. One was open, filled not with textiles, but with neatly folded women's clothing, tagged with names. Lila's jacket was on top, the star tattoo in every photo echoing in Marco's mind. In the back corner, a cage. Inside, curled in on itself, was the missing border collie. The dog lifted its head at the sound of voices, then wagged its tail weakly. Mara swore under her breath. Call animal control, she told Harris. And bag everything in here. This isn't just abduction, this smells like a trafficking op. Outside, Marco watched the dog being carried out. He noticed something glinting under its collar, a tiny GPS tracker. The screen of the retrieval device lit up with coordinates. Offshore. Part 7, the GPS trail. The tracker pinged from somewhere out in the bay, a moving point heading toward open water. Mara made calls, Coast Guard, Harbor Patrol, but by the time a boat could be dispatched, the signal stopped, freezing at a point just beyond the shipping lanes. Either they tossed it, Mara muttered, or they don't care we know where they're going. That night, Marco couldn't sleep. The scarf lay on the workbench in his shop, next to a suit he'd been altering before all this began. The anchor pattern seemed sharper under the lamplight. His mind kept replaying Lila's whisper, Benito's number. What if it wasn't a street? What if it was literally a number, a code, an ID, something hidden? He unfolded the scarf completely and noticed something he hadn't before. Tiny, almost invisible stitches along the hem, forming numbers. When he wrote them down, they made a series. The 22nd of April 17. He called Mara. That's a container code, she said after a pause. Diaz, you just found the shipment we're looking for. Part 8, the shipment, the container. registered under the 22nd of April 17, was scheduled to leave port in 2 days, bound for an undisclosed Asian location. The manifest listed it as recycled fabric bales, non-hazardous. Mara's team moved fast. A night raid was planned. Marco wasn't supposed to be there, but when Mara showed up outside Diaz Bespoke at 11 p.m., she didn't tell him to stay behind. At the docks, the air was sharp with salt and the hum of generators. The target container was already loaded onto a cargo ship. Workers moved like ants across the deck, shouts echoing in the dark. Mara's voice was clipped in the radio. Unit 4, move in. The team swarmed the container, bolt cutters snapping the seal. Inside, not fabric bales, but a series of wooden crates, each about the size of a coffin. The first one they opened held nothing but tightly packed clothing and personal effects. But the second, Mara froze. Marco's breath caught. It was Lila, alive, barely. Part 9. The rescue Lila's eyes fluttered open when the cold air hit her face. She looked up at the cluster of flashlights and froze, trembling. It's okay, Mara said softly. You're safe now. We're with the police. Marco stepped forward before he could stop himself. Lila, you're safe, he echoed. Her gaze locked on him, confused. I know you, she whispered. It didn't make sense. They had never met. Yet there was recognition in her eyes, the same strange pull Marco had felt in his dreams. A medic lifted her onto a stretcher, checking her vitals. She had bruises along her wrists, signs of restraint, but no life-threatening injuries. When Mara asked about the others, Lila's expression hardened. There are more, she said. They keep them in different containers, and they move every 3 days. The problem was, the ship's manifest didn't list any other suspicious containers. Part 1. Oh, a whisper from the dark while the Coast Guard took Lila to a secure hospital. Marco stayed with the team to process the scene. That's when he noticed a small scrap of paper taped to the inside wall of the container. It wasn't in English, it was in Italian. Marco's parents had spoken it at home, so he could read it without thinking. It said, "The tailor knows more than he should. Watch him." His skin went cold. The note wasn't for the victims. It was for the captors. Someone in the operation already knew about him, maybe even before the dream started. When he showed it to Mara, she didn't hide her alarm. Diaz, if this is true, you're in danger. And so is she. Part 11. The Man with the Star. 2 days later, Lila agreed to talk. She sat in a small interview room, her hair tied back, a blanket around her shoulders. They called him Il Navigatore, she said, the navigator. He decided who got moved where. He wore a gold ring shaped like a star, and he always carried a ledger. Marco's heart pounded. He had seen that man in his dreams. Tall, heavy coat, face shadowed, standing near the dog. But what Lila said next made the hair on his arm stand up. He asked about a tailor. Said you were the one who stitches the truth. I didn't know what he meant. Mara sat forward. Did you ever see where he went after loading containers? Yes, Lila replied. He went to a building by the pier. Blue shutters, no signs. Marco knew the place. He passed it every morning, walking to his shop. Part 12, blue shutters that night. Mara and Marco watched from across the street. The building with blue shutters looked abandoned, but around midnight, a man emerged, coat collar up, ring flashing under a streetlight. Marco's breath caught. That's him. The navigator walked briskly toward the docks, a leather-bound book under his arm. Mara's team followed at a distance, but halfway down the pier, he vanished into the shadows. No splash, no sound, gone. When they checked the area, all they found was the ledger, lying open on the ground. Inside, the names of dozens of women, and a series of Tailor's chalk marks in the margins. Marco recognized them instantly. They were his style of notation, identical to the ones he used on fabric. But he had never seen this book before. Part 13. Stitched in the shadows, Marco sat at his shop's cutting table, staring at the ledger under a desk lamp. Each chalk mark in the margins matched the way he marked custom suit patterns. A tiny dash for a sleeve, a cross for a shoulder adjustment. How is this possible? He murmured. Mara paced. Could someone have been watching you? Studying your style? Marco shook his head. These marks aren't just random. They tell me measurements. Whoever wrote this was sending me a code through my own craft. At the bottom of one page was a name, Stiaz, his father's name. Marco's pulse quickened. His father had died 20 years ago, or so he thought. Part 14, the letter from Naples. The next day, an unmarked envelope arrived at Marco's shop. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a faded photo. The paper read, "You were never meant to sew clothes. You were meant to stitch together the missing." The photo showed a young man, Marco's father, standing in front of the same building with blue shutters. Mara's jaw tightened. "Marco, I think your father wasn't just a tailor. He was involved in some kind of rescue work. Maybe the people you're dreaming about were connected to him. The dreams, the chalk marks, the note in the container. It was all part of a chain that started decades earlier." Part 15, the trap. Mara and the task force devised a plan. They would plant a fake manifest in the port as digital system, one that hinted at a shipment containing a special tailor. The hope was to lure the navigator into making a move, believing he could intercept Marco. Marco agreed to play bait. "If this is tied to my father, I need to see it through," he said. The night of the operation, Marco boarded an empty container in a secured section of the port. He carried a small sewing kit, a silent nod to his father, and a hidden comm in his ear. Hours passed. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate. The navigator's voice echoed inside. "You stitched truth." So did he. Now you'll finish his work, or disappear like he did. Part 16, the ledger's secret. Before Marco could respond, the container door slammed shut. He was trapped in darkness. He felt the floor shift. The container was being lifted onto a ship. Mura's voice crackled in his earpiece. "We've got movement. Stay calm." Marco ran his fingers along the walls and found the ledger tucked in a corner. Only this time, it wasn't the same one from before. This version had a hidden layer, thin strips of fabric sewn into the binding. Inside each strip were microfilm images of documents, shipping routes, fake IDs, offshore accounts. It wasn't just a record, it was the consortium's master key. The navigator didn't want to kill Marco. He wanted to use him, to decode the chalk mark system fully. But Marco had his own plan. Part 17, the escape pattern. Marco counted the seconds between each crane movement, memorizing the rhythm. He found a loose panel at the base of the container and used the needle from his sewing kit to pry it open. Saltwater air rushed in. They hadn't left the dock yet. He whispered into the comm, "Mara, I'm getting out." Before she could reply, the container jolted. Marco slid through the panel and dropped onto the metal scaffolding of the dockside crane. Below, 2 men in dark coats, the navigator's crew, scanned the area. Marco climbed down silently, disappearing into the maze of containers. In his hands, the ledger with the microfilm, his father's true legacy. Part 18, face to face with the navigator. The FBI traced the ship's intended route to a private island in the Mediterranean, a smuggling hub disguised as a luxury resort. They let Marco come. "You're our way in," Mara said, strapping a hidden camera to his lapel. Inside the lavish resort ballroom, the navigator sat alone at a poker table. He smiled when he saw Marco. "Your father refused me," the navigator said, shuffling cards. "He could decode our network, but chose to burn it instead. That's why he vanished. But you dreamed the patterns. You're better than him." Marco set the ledger on the table. "Better at ending you?" The ballroom lights cut. Night vision goggles snapped into place around the room. FBI agents stormed in. The navigator was arrested, but not before whispering, "We're just one route in a map you can't imagine." Part 19. The father's final thread in the aftermath. Mara handed Marco a sealed envelope recovered from the navigator's safe. Inside was a handwritten letter from his father, dated 2003. "Marco, if you're reading this, you've inherited my burden. The marks, the dreams, they're in our blood. Use them to help, not to profit. Trust no uniform without a name. And when you see the pattern of 7, run toward it, not away." Attached was a faded piece of blue cloth, the same shade as the shutters in Marco's dreams. It wasn't just a memory. It was a clue to something still unfinished. Part 20. The pattern of 7 months later. Marco's tailoring shop was quiet again. But sometimes, when he cut fabric, he saw chalk marks that weren't his own. One rainy night, a new ledger appeared on his counter. No sender, no note. Inside, only 7 marks repeated over and over. Marco looked out the window at the wet street. A black sedan idled across the road. He picked up his coat and the old piece of blue cloth, locked the shop, and stepped into the night. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved in one lifetime, but he had his father's hands, and he was ready to stitch the next truth together.